but in which so many different varied pasts and identities were also intertwined. And so this problem, if you like, of this problem not just of the interpretation of history, but of the real facts of history, the rise and dominance of the West, of the civilizations of the Atlantic, of North America and Western Europe and their affiliated countries, including far, far, far away Australia, over the world over the last 200 years has been a fundamental question for historians for decades. And it also took a particular form over the last 50 years, where globalization, and since 1989, whatever that is, that's 30 years, but 30 odd years, but in a way some of the themes of 1989 were already apparent in the 1980s, in the earlier 1980s. But this theme of globalization and the unipolar moment of Western dominance, apparently the liberal democratic rules-based order winning the game of history and defining the form of governance and culture and language for the whole world. So over the last, I don't know, since Spengler, but certainly over the last 20 years, there have been many attempts to explain, justify, criticise or foretell the end of the rise of the West or the birth of the modern. Among the people who've contributed to those debates, as well as Felipe Fernandez Mesto, like the American sort of political science scholar Samuel Huntington, a guy called Ian Morris who wrote a book called Why the West Rules for Now, a man called Emanuel Wallenstein who really invented the whole idea of world systems and core powers and peripheral powers. Neil Ferguson has contributed discussions about the killer apps of the West, and which explain the dominance of and the appeal of its way of life. And in a sort of a subtle sort of way also, the British historian Tom Holland in his book Dominion, which kind of turns the whole of history into the outworkings of Protestant Christianity, at least the whole of history since Roman times. Perhaps the most masterful, though, I think, of studies, more contained than Felipe Fernandez Mester's genius work on civilizations, but just as genius in its command of so many dimensions, is John Darwin's book After Tamerlane, which in many ways wrestles with the problem, this exact problem. How on earth did we end up in this situation where there appears to be the domination of the world by a single power, the unipolar moment, and how and when did the West rise when in 1400 it was nothing like as powerful? And of course all of this sort of discussion folds into studies of geopolitics and international relations. So you'll hear discussion of the West versus the rest, or you'll hear discussion of the rise of Chimerica, the sort of melding of the dominant Western and the dominant Eastern power. You'll hear discussion of the multipolar world as a contrast to the West, and you'll hear discussion of the emergence of civilizational states, whether they are China, India, Russia, or well, I guess America is never described as a civilizational state. It just assumes its own, dominance. And of course, quite influentially, if controversially also, Samuel Huntington wrote a book, I think in 1996, called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, which was a very crucial book in the 1990s as people tried to wrestle with the different unfolding of world history following the collapse of the Soviet Union and concerns about Islamic extremism and all that sort of thing. And Samuel Huntington's book, which I'm going to discuss a bit more later, sort of really talked about clashes of civilizations, one of which is the West, and he indeed drew kind of maps of the world defining 9 or 10 civilizations, somewhat controversially. So they are the kind of grand narratives, I guess, of civilization that inform a lot of the popular discussion of history, I guess, the kind of second-hand accounts of history that you pick up in the media and television and whatnot. Other podcasts not as well informed as this one. And, you need to be aware of how they are kind of structured in certain ways and are wrestling with a very deep problem, really, which is how on earth did this concept of the West become so dominant, and will it come to an end? Is its end nigh? And to try to wrestle with that problem, people have used the concept of civilizations. I mean, they also talk about great power politics or nation states or other sorts of things, world systems. But people do use the concepts of civilizations to make sense of global history, partly to invent, I guess, a character of a civilization, which can be a strong generalization that represents the broadest, most enduring cultural entity that we experience, a kind of a family resemblance across many different periods and many different individuals, but something that has some sort of essential unity, and to form meaningful stories for people about how we got to where we are. But viewing civilizations as a process, as Fernandez Amesto and myself recommend, tends to change the narrative of history. It means we are a little bit skeptical about viewing civilizations as something that clash, as these cultural entities that clash, but rather civilization is a process that is going on all around us and is not necessarily a battle standard by which people combat each other in geopolitics. Viewing civilizations as a process also tends to give us a little bit more of an ironic detachment from rise and fall stories. And I think it's probably this that we need to do a little bit with the idea of the West or the Western civilization. And I think especially it's important to detach a little bit and think critically, I guess, about some of those concepts, as we hear so much talk now of civilizational conflict between Russia, China, Islam, and the West. Or to talk of autocracy versus democracy in a way is a similar kind of thing. It casts in a civilizational, global sort of terms conflicts that are rather more complicated and not necessarily between the cultures as such, the peoples as such, so much as conflicts between the interests and the great states of the different parts of the world. Nonetheless, it is helpful perhaps to think about how people do use the term civilizations in this sense of, I guess, clash of civilizations, or the ultimate narrative unit in history, in world history. Samuel Huntington's summary of the scholarship on civilization really makes these points about the enormous literature that has crossed, archaeology and history, art and cultural studies. Huntington really says there are plural civilizations rather than a single civilization. He very much defended the idea that there are plural civilizations like Fernandez Amesto. But he also put the view that civilization is a form of cultural entity. He emphasised it's a cultural entity, though, it's not a nation, it's not an ethnic identity, it's a cultural entity. And it is the most comprehensive the broadest cultural entity that there is, We might owe our allegiance to our city, our football club, or our literary traditions, but beyond that we feel we belong to Islam, to Orthodoxy, to the West, as Samuel Huntington would say. And he also says that civilizations are mortal but very long-lived. They evolve, adapt, and are the most enduring of human associations. But they are cultural, not political entities, and they do not do what governments do. And essentially, Samuel Huntington sort of really defined civilizations in kind of religious terms, or in eccentric religious terms. He talked about the Orthodox civilization based around Russia, but then he talked about the West, which would seem to include both Protestant and Catholic. And some of the troubles that Samuel Huntington really had were that although in a way he wanted to his prediction was the world was becoming more modern and less Western, more modern in ways that related to the civilizational identity of the different parts of the world. He did rather trip over this problem that Fernandez Mesto spoke about of treating civilizations as actors on the world stage rather than treating civilization as a process. He essentially identified civilizations as categories, the sort of ingredient list problem that Fernandez Mesto criticised, and it led to some very odd boundaries around, what's Sinic and what's Japanese and what's Buddhist and what's Orthodox and what's Europe. Does Europe have its own separate civilization that's different to American civilization? And so on and so forth. And Felipe Fernandez Mesto, in his book Histories of Civilization, I think insists over and over again that the history of civilizations is ultimately without pattern. It ultimately does not conform to any grand narrative story. To try to fit it into a rise and fall, a cradle, maturity and death narrative is ultimately hopeless. But he does see underlying processes and he does see patterns emerging from those. But those patterns are sort of complex and driven by processes, and they lead to multiple identities rather than these single cohesive identities of single civilizations. He resists turning the story of civilization into a rise and fall story, or a story of being determined by the environment, by geography. Some people, like Jared Diamond, for example, say that the fate of world history was really determined by the geography or the physical science of the Eurasian continent and its particular endowment of resources and climate and whatnot over a certain narrow geographical band. Fernandez Mesto really sees civilization as something that can occur in any environment, but that environments do not determine the form and the character of civilization. The itch to civilize makes use of ideas and imagination, and it's the ideas and the human imagination ultimately take civilizations in all sorts of wonderfully different and plural forms. Ultimately, I guess, if you like, the contrast between all the different sort of thinkers that one can choose to guide one through a civilization, I ultimately go for historians like Fernandez Mesto or John Darwin and others who tell well-told stories, but stories that do not fit into any conventional pattern of rise and falls of these cardboard cutout characters called the West and the rest.